Welcome, everyone. My name is Manny. I'm the Executive Director here at the Hoover History Working Group, and I'd like to welcome you to hopefully the first of many historical conversations. This is a new type of event that we're hosting where we will try to apply and bring history to bear on current events in a way that is a little bit less formal than our usual seminars. But before I get started, I wanted to remind you on March 16th, we'll be hosting Roger Lowenstein on Ways and Means, his new book about Lincoln, his cabinet, and the financing of the American Civil War. On April 1st, which is April Fool's Day, Alan Guelzo will be joining us. And then on April 14th, will be Ghazan Moazin talking about Chinese banking. And so without further delay, since we only have about an hour, I will now hand it over to Neil Ferguson, who's the Milbank Family Senior Fellow here at the Hoover Institution.
Thank you, Manny, and welcome to everybody. It's Friday afternoon, but there's a war raging in Eastern Europe, and that is the kind of thing that anybody who wants to apply history must be keenly interested in. We're very fortunate to have persuaded two of the world's leading experts on the relevant history to join us. Mary Sarotte is the Kravis Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins, author of numerous books: Collapse, The Accidental Opening of the Berlin Wall, 1989, The Struggle to Create Post-Cold War Europe, and most recently, Not One Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War Stalemate. If anybody timed a book well lately, it has to be Mary's decision to publish on NATO enlargement just before a war broke out on the subject of NATO enlargement. So kudos to you. You probably weren't quite planning that, at least I hope you weren't. Chris Miller is Assistant Professor of International History at the Fletcher School at Tufts and the author of a number of very important books on modern Russian history: The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, Putinomics, Power and Money in Resurgent Russia. Both of our guests today are in a great deal of demand, and they are probably as zoomed out as any two human beings in the country, if not the world right now. I want to thank them for accepting one more Zoom invitation to talk to the Hoover History Working Group. I can only offer you, I hope, somewhat more sophisticated questions than the TV networks tend to go in for. I'm going to kick this off with a few questions from, as it were, the chair, and then open it up. If you want to intervene, the simplest way to get my attention is to raise your hand using the reactions button, like I just did. And you can also use the chat function if you prefer to put your thought in writing. Let me start, Mary, with you. There is a view that is associated with, let's say, the realist school, John Mearsheimer and others, that this war is at some level all our fault because we went too far with NATO enlargement, and that we perhaps inadvertently crossed a red line by raising the prospect of Ukraine and indeed Georgia becoming NATO members. And the more that we stuck to this idea, even though it seems we didn't really mean it, the higher the probability of a war like this became. You're really now the authority on NATO enlargement. From this new vantage point, a very different one from the vantage point when you wrote the book, how do you think about this thesis that the war is a consequence of a fundamental overreach by the United States and its European allies?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me here. Great to be here. Great to see friends like Norman Naimark, who was such a help in writing the book to talk about these important issues. Yeah, the Mearsheimer thesis, I've probably said this before in this forum, but the one phenomenon I've never observed as a historian is monocausality. Important events happen for multiple reasons. And even I, as someone who has studied NATO expansion now for many years, I do not see it as the prime cause of what is happening. I see the prime cause as what is happening is the mind of Vladimir Putin. Now, that being said, his grievances about NATO expansion obviously factor into his decision-making. So the book in particular, as you know, is not an anti-NATO expansion book. I actually think that NATO enlargement was neither unprecedented nor unreasonable. I think the problem was how it happened, and that it happened in a way that contributed to maximum aggravation with Moscow. But it's important to understand that it happened in cumulative interaction with other events and tragic self-harming Russian choices. And particularly relevant here, indeed frighteningly relevant, was Yeltsin's decision to invade Chechnya at a time when there were debates about the structure of post-Cold War Europe and where there might be a berth in it for Russia or Ukraine. Yeltsin decided to launch a brutal invasion of Chechnya, as everyone here knows, ultimately turning in the Second Chechen War Grozny into what has been declared the most destroyed city on earth. And it is, I can only use the word terrifying how much my military contacts are using the example of Grozny as what might be about to happen to various cities in Ukraine, given that Putin was largely the moving spirit behind the most brutal phase of that conflict and is obviously the moving phase now. So when Yeltsin decided to invade Chechnya, which even his own foreign minister, Kozyrov, called a bad mistake, that really helped tip the balance toward drawing a new Article 5 line across Europe. And we're seeing the consequences of that now. President Clinton had initially, and I think wisely, tried to avoid doing that because he realized, and he even said this at the time, which I found amazing, that peace in Europe depended on Ukraine. As he put it, Ukraine was the linchpin of security in Europe. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but the exact quotations are in my book, Not One Inch. And he, as the Central and Eastern Europeans, Poland and Hungary and so forth, pressed him saying, let us into NATO, give us Article 5, which is the guarantee that an attack on one will be treated as an attack on all. He said, if we do that, we're going to draw a new line. And this is President Clinton speaking. Why should we draw a new line across Europe when we just got rid of the Cold War line? If we draw a new Article 5 line, we will leave all those post-Soviet states out in the cold, especially Ukraine. And we can't do that. And then even behind closed doors, he would say to the Poles, you of all people should appreciate what it feels like to be left on the wrong side of a line. We can't do that. We have to have options for Ukraine. So we need to blur that line. We need to bring countries into NATO gradually. And if we have this partnership for peace, which post-Soviet states can join, we can blur that line by gradually letting the states in. And it gives us options to manage contingency, right? It gives us options to give people, partial NATO memberships. We can be vague about how much we're going to defend them, and that vagueness is going to be useful. Wouldn't it be great to have those options again now? But because of Yeltsin's decision to invade Chechnya, the Central and Eastern Europeans start pushing Clinton to draw that Article 5 line. He also looks at the results from the midterm congressional election of the Republicans in 1994, who supported Article 5 extension as soon as possible. Clinton realizes he needs those people if he's going to be reelected. Also, Ukrainians start to denuclearize. Ukraine had, of course, been born nuclear. And it becomes, it denuclearizes for the Budapest Memorandum. And so for all these reasons, we in the West, and Clinton in the West, we decide to draw that Article 5 line. There, I think things do become difficult because now it's, you really don't have options to manage contingency. And then the tragic problem is this then feeds into the twisted mindset of Vladimir Putin and into his grievances and helps him to instrumentalize this history and to use it as a justification for the horrific things that he's doing now.
Thanks, Mary. That gives me a chance to turn to Chris and talk some more about Vladimir Putin's mentality. There is now a quite common talking point in the US that he's lost his marbles and we're dealing here with someone unhinged. Chris, you studied Putin, and I would love to get your take on how crazy this all is, or are we still dealing here with a rational, if ruthless, actor?
Well, I think to answer that question, Neil, we need to differentiate a bit the conduct of the war over the past week and a half versus the war aims, because I think the conduct of the war is really hard to describe as closely tethered to political realities in Ukraine and Russia's ultimate political goals. If you knew that there was going to be substantial Ukrainian resistance, you would have structured your military operation differently. And the only reason that the Russians didn't do that is because they were confused by their own propaganda about Ukrainian weakness and division, and as a result made errors in judgment about how to structure the military operation. But the goals, I think, behind the war we're seeing right now are not at all unhinged or crazy. They're deeply built into Russian foreign policy thinking, and there's I think nothing that surprising in some ways, as Mary said, that Ukraine is the flashpoint where all of this is coming together, because Putin, he's certainly accelerated his discussion of Ukraine over the past 12 months or so, following on his article from last June on the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people. But of course, Russia has been at war in Ukraine for almost a decade now. And its influence operations in Ukraine in terms of trying to swing elections or trying to manage different groups of oligarchs to achieve its political goals have been present for a very long time and are widely accepted and popular among Russia's foreign policy elite. So I think we'd be wrong to say this is all about Putin or all about one person becoming unhinged, because you can draw pretty clear lines, not only to the early years of Putin's time in power, but even back to the 1990s, when there were lots of Russian politicians on the far right of the political spectrum who were espousing broadly similar aims.
Now, we're historians and we're supposed to stick to the past according to the traditional job description, but I'm going to push you both to do something that I frequently do, to the great disgust of many more conventional historians, and think about what comes next. As Chris says, this has not gone according to Putin's plan, and we are now in a highly complex situation in which 5 or 6 different things are happening, and it's hard to really tell which will happen fastest. There's the war itself, and I think it's unclear how quickly, if at all, Russia can declare victory and how Pyrrhic any victory would be. There are the sanctions and their impact on the Russian economy and how quickly that will bring Russia to its knees and whether quickly enough to influence the outcome of the war. Then there's the domestic situation in Russia. How secure is Putin? Has he got to the Khrushchev zone where he's now behaved in such a reckless way that he's likely to fall victim to some kind of palace coup? There's the wider question of diplomatic intervention. The Chinese have indicated some interest in playing the role of ceasefire, if not peace brokers. And maybe we should also bear in mind the great but ephemeral force of Western public opinion, which seems to have a relatively short half-life if our outrage at the fall of Afghanistan is anything to go by. So, Mary, thinking about all these different things that are going on, as you say, in a non-monocausal historical process, give us your, I don't know, 1, 2, 3 scenarios as we try to think about how this plays out. And I guess we should also include in the mix the fact that Putin's shown himself ready to threaten to go nuclear, which has to be a big part of this story.
Right. Obviously, I don't have any monopoly on the future, so I actually would be interested in your take on this, Neil, and some of the other people in the room as well. I just have some speculation to offer, which of course, ranges from more hopeful to more grim. On the more hopeful side, this may be too optimistic. My hope is that the strong men around Putin decide that they don't want to live in North Korea for the rest of their lives, because Putin is increasingly turning Russia into North Korea. And so I think a good outcome, frankly, would be if they decide to move him aside. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about regime change. I don't think suddenly Russia would be a democracy again, and it would all be, you know, wine and roses. But I do think that just as in some ways the anti-Semitic genocidal aspect of World War II was really tied to Hitler personally, I think that a lot of what is happening is tied to Putin's personal grievances. And if he personally could be moved aside, that some of the worst brutality that I fear is to come could be avoided. Also on the hopeful scenario would obviously be some kind of Russian popular uprising. I was heartened a tiny bit by the pictures out of actually Berlin last weekend, where 100,000 people basically marched to support of Ukraine. And if you saw the pictures, most of them had the Brandenburg Gate in the background, which is where, as you know, on November 9th, 1989, the power of the people overcame tyrants and dictators. And I thought, you know, you should be very wary of what you've started, Mr. Putin, because this might be what finally causes that in your home country. So those are more optimistic scenarios, although those would obviously be complicated and, you know, not happy scenarios. What is currently going on now, I've been thinking of as banks versus tanks. So we are basically trying to see how quickly we can bankrupt a country, basically Russia. And we're hoping that Zelensky can hold out against the tanks while we do that. The hope is that this will cause, again, people inside the country to, you know, the strong man to somehow stop what they're doing. I doubt very much Putin will stop, but perhaps if they see the degree to which we're going to bankrupt Russia, they will be able to find the resolve they need to find. And so Zelensky basically needs to keep the country alive while that process is going on, since he's obviously not going to defeat Russia militarily. Going down the scenario of more hopeful to more grim, obviously in a war between Russia and Ukraine, Russia wins that war, but it's not clear to me that Russia wins the insurgency that follows, right? Russia has something like a little south of 200,000 troops. That's enough to wreck a country. That is not enough to rule a country. I was heartened to hear the military analyst, Michael Kaufman, who, if you're not following him on Twitter, you should be, saying today that he actually thinks this whole operation is shot, not in military terms, but because there's just no way they're going to be able to hold Ukraine with anything like the forces that they have, given the way Ukraine has rallied against it. So I think there's certainly an ugly insurgency coming. Getting to the more grim scenarios, some of the military folks I'm in touch with, looking at the equipment that's moving into place, they are seeing the assembling of a force package that could create Grozny level destruction. So in other words, you circle a city. If you're in a good mood, you give the civilians a window to get out, and then you reduce the city to rubble. So that is now within the realm of the possible. And then obviously now we're getting to the worst case scenarios. I was deeply worried about the fact that the Russians were not careful enough to avoid live fire near a nuclear plant. I obviously realized it wasn't hit, but that's a lot of risk. That's also a war crime. And the fact that Putin is talking about nuclear saber rattling is obviously very, very concerning. Now, for me, I think the big question, and this again, I'd be appreciative of just discussing with the group here. I think we obviously need to be cognizant of the risks. And I just published a New York Times op-ed, and Chris had a New York Times op-ed too. We've both been hounded by op-ed editors for the past couple of weeks. I just published an op-ed on the potential risks of inadvertent escalation, which was the topic the New York Times wanted. But on the other hand, I don't think that can deter us. This is a real breaking point in modern history, and we need to find a way to make this violence stop. So the question is, what can we do that doesn't lead to nuclear war? And here I really do think applying history works, because there haven't been many examples of this, but we did have the Cuban Missile Crisis. And as you know from Graham Allison's work, what eventually did it was a combination of three things, which Graham referred to as the magic cocktail. The first was a public deal, which is, the public deal is, if you take the missiles out, we won't invade. Then there was a private sweetener, which is, don't talk about this in public, no quid pro quo, but we will take the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey. But there was also a private ultimatum, which is, you need to get those out in 48 hours or we're going to do something about it. In other words, we call Khrushchev's bluff. And so the question is, at what point do we say something similar to Putin and say, you need to stop this in 48 hours, or we are going to send in A-10 warthogs and destroy that column of tanks, or we are going to establish a no-fly zone. In other words, how do we take this to the brink without going over? And I think that is an immense challenge, one of the biggest we faced. And I think that actually historians are uniquely positioned to help answer that. I mean, I would say that, but I genuinely believe that. So I'd be interested in the thoughts of this group on those questions.
I agree with you, Mary. I could tell you the number of quite eminent people who've asked me about a no-fly zone in the last 8 or 9 days has surprised me, because that would so obviously be an act of war in the eyes of Putin. And that is indeed why I think he rattled the nuclear saber, to make sure that that was quickly taken off the table. But it concerns me that we did in fact back down very quickly when he started to use that language. Feels as if we're forgetting some of the rules of the Cold War.
Yes. Actually, if I could just jump in, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, announced he was canceling a Minuteman test because he didn't want to. I'm like, why are we canceling it? Let's blow some things up.
Absolutely. This is like, to me, as a student of the Cold War, really shocking. We are showing considerable weakness and encouraging Putin to think that he can use this threat to compensate for his relatively poor performance on the ground, and it is deterring us, I think, from giving the Ukrainians the kind of assistance that might be meaningful. I was against the no-fly zone because I thought that was too escalatory, but I was in favor of making fighter jets and, for that matter, drones available to the Ukrainians. Chris, let me turn to you now, and I'm going to start encouraging other participants to start raising their hands and getting involved. Norman, I'm looking at you. I'll certainly want to call on you after some of your excellent comments in public on this subject, but let me give Chris one more a crack at this. If you were not just writing op-eds, but advising President Biden, what would you say? Jake Sullivan, I hear, has just been fired, and Chris Miller has been appointed National Security Advisor after correctly forecasting the invasion and correctly calling just about every turn of events this year. So you're suddenly in that situation room, and the president turns to you, and you are put on the spot. What should we do?
The more I think about how the invasion is likely to keep playing out, the more it does seem really important which territory falls in the next couple of weeks, because it's clear the Russian advance is moving very slowly. It's clear that as time passes, Ukraine will begin to find its capabilities in the conventional sense degraded, but it will also show more and more to the Russians how capable it is of imposing costs. As weeks pass, Russian losses are going to increase dramatically. And in the Federation Council today, one Russian senator publicly began speaking about the losses that already are being faced. Now, they're described as being in the interest of the special operation in the Donbass, but nevertheless, this is real. Their losses not just among contract soldiers, but also among draftees, and the economic losses at home are also escalating. So there's all these pressure points on the Russians that make a long war very unappetizing and perhaps even impossible to wage, which makes the next couple of weeks, I think, pretty decisive. And right now, it's very unclear. Does Odessa get attacked in a serious manner or not? Does Kiev fall? Does Kharkiv fall? Because if these cities don't fall in the next couple of weeks or maybe 2 months, it seems pretty plausible that Russia at that point will be looking for some sort of ceasefire or deal with Zelensky. And so I would be pushing to give the Ukrainians all the time that they have, because yes, they're going to lose the war in a conventional military sense, but how they lose and with what map they lose is still very much open to question. And I think it's quite possible that we end up in a couple of months with Ukraine maybe even still holding on to Kiev. Certainly holding on to Odessa is very possible, and half of Ukrainian territory, if not more, could well be in Ukraine's hands. It won't be pretty. It's going to be a brutal couple of weeks, but I don't think Russia can sustain this at this level over a sustained period of time. Just one of the data point, already Russia has lost 3% of its tanks in 9 days of war. So map that out over a couple of weeks.
a Ukrainian friend of mine said to me on the eve of the Russian invasion, we'll be like the Mujahideen, alluding to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And he looks like being vindicated, but by comparison with the military assistance that we gave the Afghan Mujahideen, the assistance we're giving Ukraine is still really rather modest. I did the math, and it's a lot less. I must confess, if I were in that hot seat advising the president, I would be urging him to maximize the assistance, particularly with respect to air defenses that we can give Zelensky to keep the Ukrainian resistance going. Because I agree with your view that the more protracted this is, the better the prospects that Putin is forced into some kind of diplomatic compromise. Norman, it's great to see you. I was reading an interview you did earlier today and agreeing with your remarks. You're someone who knows this region well and knows that it has an almost unique track record for lethal organized violence over the last century. I remember when I was writing War of the World, reading some of your stuff and thinking, one of the great puzzles is why Ukraine, always Ukraine, why so many disastrous events have played out there. Give me your sense of how long the Ukrainians can hold out. What has been your reaction to the rather extraordinary spectacle of a former sitcom actor becoming a heroic wartime president? How long do you think Ukraine can hold out? And is it reasonable to draw parallels with Afghanistan in the 1980s?
First of all, let me just say, I think you asked the right questions, Neil, and I think our panelists gave, our thanks for inviting Chris and Mary. I thought they gave excellent answers. And I think one of the things I'd add before I turn to your questions, one of the things I really wanted to add, is implicit in your question about, how long they can hold out, and also about Zelensky. You didn't mention also that he's Jewish, which is a sort of interest, a Jewish comedian, right? Who's now president of Ukraine, and you get these wonderful, these wonderful little pieces of humor as he speaks to us, even with his beard and his T-shirt, he still has this marvelous sense of humor. I like the one, especially where he said, "Don't give me a ride, give me guns." I thought that was really fantastic.
That's one for the history books, without a doubt.
Yeah. So a couple of things that I would say. First of all, we all are in admiration of Ukraine and the Ukrainians and what they've done in this war. And Chris is absolutely right. The war started in 2014. I mean, it didn't start just with this invasion. I mean, they've behaved extremely well. And the other thing that's happened, I mean, and it's important, again, as historians, we note this, that nations are made. They're not, they're not there. They're not, some kind of thing that exists in the abstract. They're constantly being made. And the Ukrainians, especially over the last 8 years, have created, an extraordinary nation, one dedicated to, principles of freedom and democracy, of sovereignty versus the Russians, from Maidan, this revolution of dignity, which is an important event, really, not just in the history of Eastern Europe, but in the history, of the West, of the world, you could say, because this is, like solidarity, like other moments like this. It's an extremely important part of how we think about the development of democracy and liberty in the world. So the Ukrainians have turned themselves, interestingly, into a fighting nation in which there seems to be almost no dissent whatsoever about this standing up to the Russians and how one stands up to the Russians. And even those Russians who live in Ukraine, with the exception of some in Donetsk and a few others, I'm sure, around, although we don't hear much reporting about them, but they're not going to be that many, are now Ukrainians, and are calling themselves Ukrainians, even if they speak Russian much better than they do Ukrainian. And there are a lot of people like that. And it's an incredible development. That's all I would say about that. Zelensky also, who was a contested figure in the Ukrainian elections, won in some cases, in some analyses, against all odds. And there were, plethora of candidates and a plethora of political parties, but he won in part because of his notoriety and his television kind of past. Has become this extraordinary leader, much as the Ukrainians themselves have become an extraordinary nation in some ways. So, this is all very impressive, and it means, I think, and again here, we join all our colleagues in the difficulty of trying to predict what's going to happen. It means, I think, that this will be protracted. This is going to take a long time. I mean, I think Chris has that just right as well, that this is not going to be easy. And even if somehow, and given the preponderance of power, this may be inevitable, I don't know, the Russians win the battle, as it were, for Ukraine in terms of the military battle, and even being able to establish some kind of occupation regime. I've spent some time studying occupations too, and what everybody says is correct. It takes more than what they have now, to successfully occupy, a country of over 40 million people. It was one thing, as Mary knows very well, to occupy Eastern Germany, 17 million people with 170,000 Soviet troops. They don't have that many to occupy Ukraine.
380,000 Soviet troops.
Well, 280,000 depends. It came and went. So it's going to be extremely difficult for them, to occupy the country. But let's assume they do. Ukraine has changed forever. They will not, buckle under an imperial master in the way that, Putin hoped or hopes they will. They're just not going to do it. And the result is, as you mentioned, Neil, I think there's going to be a lot of fighting before this is over. I mean, even once the occupation has begun, as I mentioned in that piece that I sent you, the Ukrainians fought well into the 50s, against the Sovietization of Ukraine, especially in Western Ukraine. And a lot of that same tradition is there. And there's another tradition, by the way, that's sort of interesting, that the ministries, the Ministry of Defense and Zelensky's office is mentioning, which is the Cossack tradition. And the Cossacks also didn't exactly fall over and were easily occupied, by the Russian Empire. I mean, they made a deal with the Russian Empire at one point in the 17th century, but they also fought very hard and continuously, and on and off really, against imperial domination. And that's part of the Ukrainian kind of national ethos too. So there's a lot of reason to think that this will go on for a while. I mean, people have talked about a potential frozen conflict future, but that frozenness is going, is certainly going to be melted in a lot of places by resistance, I think, and bloodshed, which is too bad. So let me leave it at that.
I had a rather heated discussion with our colleague Frank Fukuyama the other day, in which he accused me of defeatism because I was somewhat bleak in my assessment of the Ukrainians' prospects. I'm beginning to wonder if he might be right, though, because the more I think about this, the combination of a pretty poor performance in the field and far, far more severe sanctions than Putin foresaw makes me wonder if we might be surprised by how quickly he starts to seek some diplomatic off-ramp before his situation becomes absolutely parlous. I'm beginning to question my own pessimism the more I hear about the military situation on the ground. But I want to step back and take a global view now. I can't resist welcoming the great Mel Leffler to this group, and as one of the preeminent historians of the Cold War. I can't think of anyone better to give us a global perspective on this. If you don't mind me cold calling you, Mel. My sense is that we can't view this too narrowly, that we must recognize that this is part of a global strategic problem that the United States confronts. And China's role is extraordinarily important here. My sense is that this would never have gone ahead without Xi Jinping's blessing, that it was timed to happen after the Beijing Olympics for a reason, and that China's really Putin's only hope at this point to keep the economy from complete implosion. And of course, from an Asian vantage point, the question is Taiwan next? So I don't know if you buy my now well-established argument that we're in Cold War II. We just don't want to face it, Mel. I suspect you probably don't. But tell me how you think about this, at least in a global framework. I think that would help us all.
Well, I appreciate your talking to me. I need to preface my remarks by saying that I'm in Toronto taking care of my 5-year-old granddaughter. So I'm not likely to be on this very much longer. But I much appreciate the discussion that's gone on. I really think that it's been excellent. I would just comment by very much supporting the notion that for the United States at least, it's really imperative to think of this in global terms. And I think that the most compelling factor to ensure that Putin does not succeed, except at very, very, very great cost, is that I do think that the Chinese are watching this carefully with regard to Taiwan. And I think that that should be a major preoccupation and focal point. So I think in that perspective, it's very important. In both situations, I think what I would learn from the Cold War is a question. And that is, I think it's imperative for policymakers, both with regard to Ukraine and with regard to Taiwan, to think deeply about what constitutes a vital interest, justifying the prospect of waging war. And I think that the answer to that question is a very complicated one in which reasonable people will disagree. But before people start arguing, as occasionally I hear, and implying that the United States should in fact take stronger actions in Ukraine, for example, one does need to think about to what extent is Ukraine really a vital interest to the United States, justifying the risk of an escalatory cycle leading to a global war. In that context, I would say that I think that President Biden has handled this situation pretty adroitly so far. I'm not sure if, in retrospect, if I would have said in a declaratory sense that we would never enter Ukraine or never engage in military action in Ukraine. I think that's the right policy, but I don't necessarily think that it should have been a declaratory policy in advance, and certainly undermined what might have been some marginal deterrent impact. But I do think that the thrust of what American policy should be right now, if you had asked me what you asked Chris, and Chris I think gave a very good answer about if he were Jake Sullivan, what he would be arguing, I would be saying that the United States should be doing everything it can to prepare to support a long insurrection in conjunction with its allies. What I would learn from the Cold War is how imperative it is to keep a cohesive alliance together, to preserve allied cohesion, to make certain your allies are with you in supporting this venture. And I think that given the complexities of European politics, that Biden has done a pretty good job. I think he needs to sustain it. I'm amazed actually by some of the support that numerous European countries are providing. I am of the opinion, Neil, different from what you said a few minutes ago, that that we are offering far more aid to Ukraine than we offered to the Mujahideen. I don't know how you measure that, but in terms of the amount of economic and military supplies, I would say that it far exceeded. I think what you need to provide Ukraine requires a commitment of aid and support far in excess than what we provided the Mujahideen. But I think that has been forthcoming. And I think we have probably encouraged our allies and an amazing amount of support from countries that I would not have thought would make commitments, like Sweden and Switzerland. I think thinking globally and preserving allied cohesion and readying to support a long insurrection are critical. I would also say one other thing from the Cold War, and that is how imperative it is, even while pursuing a tough containment policy, it's also extraordinarily important to engage and to be ready to engage in diplomacy and to pick up on overtures and maybe even to make appropriate overtures to try to ratchet down the incredible strife that's going on. So I've spoken long enough. Thanks for asking me.
Thanks so much, Mel, and have fun with the grandchild. I think this puts me in mind of 1973, when the U.S. simultaneously armed the Israelis and then initiated the ceasefire and peace negotiations. I worry a little bit that we might be letting the Chinese take the initiative when it comes to brokering peace. And I want to take advantage of the fact that we have Aaron and Brett Carter on as people who think a lot about China. Aaron, I'm trying to get a sense of just how Xi Jinping and indeed the Chinese people think about all this. My sense is that he gave a green light. The Chinese Foreign Ministry is trying to kind of have it both ways and blows hot and cold depending on who's the audience. But tell us a bit about how this is being thought of in China, and whether I'm right that there's a sort of possibility here for the Chinese to be the ceasefire brokers.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. And thank you all for these really illuminating thoughts. So I think one way to look at this issue is to draw a contrast. I think we're really seeing a point at which the Chinese foreign policy has really changed. So in Hank Paulson's memoirs, which are wonderful, just absolutely engaging if you hadn't had a chance to read them, there's this wonderful anecdote about how right after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, Moscow called Beijing and proposed to both work together to sell U.S. Treasury bonds, and in so doing deepen the American recession. And what Paulson recounts is that at the time, Beijing, declined the offer, said no thanks, and called Washington and said, I just want you to know, Moscow made us this offer, we declined. And I think that was a really interesting story about how Beijing at the time was very much invested in some aspects of the global liberal order, or at least, the economic benefits that it was receiving from it. I think a really interesting contrast is a story that appeared in the New York Times earlier this week by Ed Wong, that was an absolute bombshell, which documented how the United States had spent months pressuring China to go represent Russia and try to pressure Russia to not invade Ukraine. Beijing obviously punted on that, and evidence shows actually shared the intelligence the U.S. was giving to China with Russia to say, like, we know about this troop buildup. So I think that that's a really interesting signal about how China's stance towards trying to maintain the sort of global liberal order is really pivoted to supporting Russia's efforts to really dismantle something into a more traditionally adversarial system. Now, I think that there are two other aspects that bear mentioning. One is that what China, I think you put it exactly right, with foreign ministry trying to have it both ways in many ways. But I think that what you can see with China doing domestically in its messaging about the conflict is very revelatory. So in particular on social media, there's been a huge amount of astroturfing where the CCP is using its 50-cent army to boost what Russia is doing, to sort of praise the Russian military operations, to not call it an invasion, and to really place as much blame as possible on the United States. So I think that effort to frame this military operation as legitimate to the Chinese people is something that's really noteworthy. And second, I think that there's a big connection with something else that's going on at Hoover today. There's the launch of the digital currency report about China's efforts to build a digital currency. There are a lot of meetings about that earlier this morning. And I think that there's been a lot of discussion in the press over the last 2 or 3 days about how, China perhaps should be praised for signing on and complying with SWIFT sanctions against Russia. I think we have to be really careful in interpreting that as a signal of the CCP's commitment to being sort of a responsible stakeholder in the international system, because in recent years the CCP had a very interesting strategy of allowing specific banks to engage in trade and financing of North Korea. But when that was sort of found out by the international community, the CCP just said, we didn't know anything about that. So I think that there are ways that the CCP could easily find to support Russia's activities while sort of having the image of complying and sort of being a positive role in this conflict internationally. So that would be my interpretation.
Thanks, Aaron. That's really helpful. Nobody's been raising a hand, so I've just been moderating my way through this by means of a cold call. But I'm glad to see that Brett has just broken the ranks and raised his hand. I'm gonna go to you, and then if we have time, and remember we're down to 8 minutes now, I'd like to get Tyler Goodspeed to give us some insight into the economic consequences of the war, which I think will have a huge bearing on just how long it lasts. But Brett.
Yeah, of course. And thanks so much to you, Neil, and to our other colleagues for organizing what's been a really fascinating session, and of course to Mary and to Chris for joining us. So I'd like to take Neil's invitation seriously. So my question was to Mary Sarotte. There was something that she said earlier that I thought was very fascinating, but also that struck me as puzzling in a way. So Mary Sarotte mentioned that in thinking about the prospects for some kind of domestic change engineered by Putin's kind of inner circle, she suggested that it was probably the case that most kind of regime insiders didn't want to live in North Korea, But it seems to me that maybe the better analogy is living in Xi Jinping's China, or perhaps even Hu Jintao's China. So I was curious, why she went for the North Korea analogy rather than the China analogy, and if indeed the China analogy is more appropriate, to what extent she thought that Putin's kind of ruling elite would actually be quite happy to live in perhaps maybe not Xi's China, but certainly Hu's China, and then kind of what that kind of portends for prospects for some kind of domestic change of government.
Yeah, obviously that's obviously it's an exaggeration for effect, but the world hasn't cut off China's central bank. So I think we're headed, that is a nuclear option, right? Central banks are supposed to be sacrosanct, like embassies. And we're, I think, rapidly heading to a point where we're not going to let Russia earn money from its natural resources. We're not anywhere near that with China. I do think we're heading, I don't know if we'll get there, but I think the sanctions have moved through rapidly through various phases, right? The sanctions first were meant to deter, which they didn't do. And then they were meant to punish, which they did to some extent, but now they're meant to bankrupt, right? We are trying to destroy Russia's economy. I don't see us destroying China's economy, although I'd be interested to talk to Neil about that. I actually would be interested to hear from Neil what you think will happen if China tries to invade Taiwan. This is obviously a situation I know much less well than the European situation. So I do think that the peril is more North Korea than China, and that and also you can fly to China, right? Everywhere that counts is now closed airspace. They're going to cut off trains. They're going to cut off border crossings. People are fleeing Moscow now, right? It's now gotten to the phase in Moscow. My Moscow friends are texting each other saying, "Are you still here?" Right? Every time Putin announces a speech, they think it's going to be the speech that declares martial law. So I think that the end state is more North Korea than China. And then the question is, do you want to live somewhere that is so, and now you can't access Facebook. Now, I saw this list today on Twitter. I didn't even know if it was accurate, but even if it was only partially accurate, the list of companies that are no longer doing business in China is immense. They're not going to supply aircraft parts, right? Are you going to want to even get on a plane? Right? In China, you can get on a plane. So I'd be interested in, Neil, what your thoughts are.
Yeah, of course, the North Korean analogy is a little misleading just because ideologically, this is not some rehashed Soviet Union. People sometimes forget, if they haven't gone to Russia, that Russia is radically different from the Soviet Union today.
True, the ideology is different.
It's a nationalist, conservative, orthodox regime with, a curious oligarchical, kleptocratic elite with Putin at its center. But I think you're right in saying that the economics take Russia back many decades very fast. And Russia, which in the period after the 90s became highly integrated in the world economy, is suddenly being cut out of it as quickly as Germany was cut off from overseas trade in 1914. And I do actually think that we haven't seen sanctions of this nature since the time of the world wars. We're almost out of time, but let me cheat by passing the buck to Tyler Goodspeed to get a quick read from one of the world's most gifted economic historians on the economic consequences of the war. And if you can squeeze that into 2 minutes, we can get a last word from our panelist, Chris Miller, and then I'm afraid we're going to be out of time. Tyler.
Sure, I'll try to be brief, I guess. First, I struggle to see how Russia avoids complete autarky simply because of the nature of the sanctions. If I'm a Russian importer, how the heck am I going to be getting my hands on dollars and euros with which to pay foreign exporters? And I don't see them being able to get around via Bitcoin or whatever else. And then in terms of the domestic US implications, look, we're not as reliant upon, well, first of all, I mean, the United States doesn't import much oil directly from Russia. Generally speaking, we're not nearly as dependent on imported oil as Western Europe. But nonetheless, even though this isn't the same regime as in the 1970s, we do still have an elasticity of US output with respect to the global price of oil of about negative 0.02%, which means a persistent exogenous shock to the global price of oil of 10% is going to shave 0.2% off US output. And if we're looking at a bigger and more persistent shock than 10%, then scale that up accordingly. And then finally, I mean, just if I'm a private economic actor and I'm looking at the rapidity with which severance of an economy from the global economy can proceed, I'm wondering about a real acceleration of trends already underway, even before COVID, in terms of reshoring or nearshoring from China. So in a January 2020 survey by Bank of America of 3,000 multinational firms with $67 trillion in market capitalization, that survey found that 80% of firms in 12 sectors with global supply chains expected to shift at least a portion of their supply chains from current locations. And a UBS survey 2 months later said the survey respondents said that they were chief financial officers of multinational enterprises in the US, North Asia, and China suggested that 20 to 30% of their production capacity would be relocated from China, most of it going to the US, Canada, Japan, or Mexico, were the leading candidates among relocation. So, I mean, does this accelerate some of the deglobalization trends that were already underway, not only before Russia, but before COVID?
Well, one thing's for sure, Tyler, if any part of the world can do autarky, it's the vast Eurasian landmass that extends from Western Russia to China. We are, alas, out of time, but I want to give Chris the last word as we began with Mary and Chris hasn't had a chance to wrap this up. Chris, let me hand the last word to you. It strikes me that the hardest thing about applying history is that the unexpected can come along and do what the fall of the Berlin Wall did in 1989. Mary's written, of course, about that. And I'm sitting here wondering if some comparable event is going to surprise us, because it will turn out that, in fact, Putin's military and political power were less than we thought. If one thing would surprisingly unsurprise me, it would be that he folds faster than just about everyone in this call expects. Can you give me a probability on that scenario ex ante?
Well, I will say, Neil, that I've been personally struck by all of my contacts in Moscow who 2 weeks ago I would have put in the pro-government camp, now posting on Facebook in the final minutes before it's finally banned from Russia their opposition to the war, which I think puts the Russian government in a complicated position, because one of the challenges of protests and coups is that it's dangerous to move first. But if you already know that all of your Facebook friends in their final Facebook post were stating the opposition to the war, that makes protests and coups both a lot easier. So I think you're right that there's a lot more domestic pressure than his repressive apparatus might suggest.
Lots of non-linearity in history, and I'm not going to call it a black swan. My sense is precisely that we as historians should be ready for the abrupt discontinuity that most people didn't see coming. Remember, most people didn't think this invasion would happen, and you, Chris, were one of the people who predicted with high confidence that it would. Well, thank you so much to everybody for joining this call. I think it's always worth our while as historians sitting down and comparing notes between bouts of Zooming with the media, or for that matter, with folks in government who want to pick our brains. It was mentioned to me the other day by an eminent nonagenarian that there was a kind of strange lack of historical perspective in much of the discussion going on in government about this crisis. My strong conviction is, and has been for many years, that the people in government need to think much more historically than they do. And turning around when the crisis has begun and asking for a quick briefing on the history of Ukraine is not really the way to do this. Thank you to Mary Sarotte. Thank you to Chris Miller. Thank you to everybody who joined and didn't mind being cold. I hope this thing is over soon. It wouldn't certainly be in keeping with Ukraine's tradition if it was to end soon with minimal casualties. I think that would be a breakthrough in Ukraine's history. But who knows? Perhaps this time finally will be different for that poor country. Anybody who is able to watch this, who is Ukrainian or is close to Ukraine, I hope it's been of some value to provide some context for this latest disaster in Ukraine's history. With that, I'll wrap things up and look forward to seeing you at our next Applied History meeting of the Hoover History Working Group. Thanks, everybody.